Good evening. Welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook, and it's the 51st week of 2013. Tonight we'll hear commentaries from Ron Szoke on military malfeasance and from Karen Aram on the State Department official Charles Freeman. If there's time, we have a number of videos on current issues, and we'll see what happens with that. On this program, we discuss the U.S. war-making in the Middle East and around the world, and try to explain why President Obama is expanding that war and killing children, while he's pretending to the American people that, as he says, he's winding it down. People are not fools. In spite of all the administration's misrepresentations, the latest polls show that almost 3 out of 4 Americans want the president to bring the war to an end and to bring the troops home. Which makes it clear, by the way, that the Obama administration is not working for those Americans. But because of President Obama's intense propaganda and the shameful cooperation of the American media, most Americans don't know the extent of the war that the U.S. has brought to the rest of the world. At our recent anti-war demonstrations in Champaign and Urbana, the most frequently asked questions are, what war? And by those a little bit better informed, which war? AWARE, our local anti-war group, has been around for 12 years, since the 9/11 attacks, when a number of residents of Champaign-Urbana saw that the U.S. government would use the 9/11 crimes as an excuse to carry on and expand its decades-long wars for the control of Middle East energy resources. Today, the U.S. government is threatening, invading, and occupying countries in a vast circle with a 5,000-mile radius, or 5,000-mile diameter, around the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to the borders of India and China, a region sometimes called the Greater Middle East. The U.S. military calls it Central Command. The region has the world's greatest concentration of oil and natural gas, and our government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars month after month to control it. Control, and not just access to these energy resources, is what the U.S. demands. We, in fact, import little of our own oil supplies from the Mideast. Most of our imported oil comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of world energy supplies gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. These wars are not in the interest of 99% of Americans, only the 1% who profit from armaments and oil. In other words, President Obama is killing men, women, and children in Asia and Africa in our name because China and other countries need oil, and our government intends to have control over where they get it. The president says he's conducting these vastly expensive wars to stop terrorism and protect civilians. But we can see that instead he's killing civilians and creating terrorists. These wars are not in America's interest. It's the 1% who profit from them. Most Americans don't know that President Obama is conducting the world's greatest terrorist campaign. But the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London estimates the president has killed perhaps 4,000 people with drones alone, including some 200 children. And that's only part of his global assassination campaign. Within the first 5 months of Obama's presidency in 2009, he not only sent tens of thousands more U.S. troops to Afghanistan, he'd been elected with the notion that he would bring these wars to an end, he also authorized a massive expansion of clandestine military and intelligence operations worldwide. He ordered special forces to be sent into both friendly and hostile nations in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. The deployment of highly trained American killers, that's what they were, that's what they are, into dozens of new countries was designed, in General Petraeus' words, to penetrate, disrupt, defeat, or destroy enemies of the U.S. beyond the rule of law with no trials or pretenses of accountability. They were also to prepare the environment for larger attacks from the U.S. and NATO. The Obama administration was not just responding to terrorism. Today, the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, the American death squads, consists of perhaps 66,000 U.S. troops, active in more than 100 countries around the world, according to their own spokesman. These troops are accountable not to Congress, but to the President's National Security Council. They're a private army, killing people around the world in what is nothing less than the world's greatest terrorist campaign, run out of the White House. And the White House says, of course, all these operations are secret. No wonder the U.S. is hated around the world. Why is Obama carrying on this secret global assassination campaign when it's obvious that it increases terrorism? We can only conclude, hard as it is to believe, that the U.S. government wants this war, even including terrorist attacks against U.S. interests and citizens. If there were no war, the U.S. would have no excuse for occupying the world's greatest energy-producing region. Obama's problem is the American people, who recently stopped him from bombing Syria. Americans don't want more war and are suffering from the administration's economic policies. But politicians, bankers, and corporations do want war, so it's clear whom Obama is working for. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to help frustrate the 1%'s war policy as it's put into practice by President Obama. And we'll begin tonight with Ron Szoke, military malfeasance, and there's enough of that to go around, I think.
Oh, yes, plenty it seems. I'm wearing my Bah Humbug hat.
In honor of
today.
the season, right?
Yes, yes. So I'm trying to get myself psyched up for the season. So maybe it'll be Merry Christmas next week, who knows. News today, 6 more American servicemen killed in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. Apparently there was no shooting involved. It was according to the online story, mechanical failure, but all of those on board were killed. Apparently there were Afghan militants on the ground, and they may have contributed to the deaths, but it's not clear yet. It was too recent for us to get a clear and straight story about it. Japan is acquiring more military equipment from the USA and building military ties. The right-wing premier, Abe, is known as something of a militarist, and Japan seems to be putting behind it its official pacifist constitution that was forced upon it by the USA in the late 40s. So Japan had no official military for a long time, but they've been evading the constitutional requirements and working on loopholes for so long now that they are becoming a military power, and the USA is going to supply them with military equipment to build up their military strength. Just been announced we'll have closer military ties with the Philippines as well, and we are contributing a good deal of military equipment to them. In all of these cases, it seems they're being given military aid by allocating large sums of money to them to buy all of this equipment, ships, planes, missiles, and so on, drones, and with the specification typically that they have to buy those things from American makers, which is putting the money, well, it circulates out to them and then comes back to Americans, to the armaments makers, and they're making tons of money out of the deal. So people who think that we're just contributing a lot of money abroad are a little naive about the circular process that's going on, I think. Another aspect, of course, is that we're building up military strength in the Western Pacific in anticipation of the coming conflict with China, many say. And this is the most utterly foolish, stupid thing that I can think of. We are very good at knocking over small countries, but if we tangle with China, that's another matter entirely. And I would be extremely hesitant about that. I wanted to comment on the continuing deterioration of the military. Corruption in the Navy, New York Times, November 7th. Records cite lavish gifts in Navy bribery case. A ship servicing contractor promised to arrange prostitutes for a Navy commander and his buddies in Malaysia and Singapore in 2009, according to court records. The officer, Jose Luis Sanchez, shot back a Facebook message saying, "Yummy, daddy like." The federal authorities say that that was not all that Commander Sanchez, 41, liked about the contractor. Over the past 5 years, the company charged Mr. Sanchez and other Navy officials with lavish trips, nights with prostitutes, and tickets to the Lion King and a Lady Gaga concert in exchange for help on a scheme to overbuild the Navy by millions of dollars, according to court records. So the contractor, Leonard Glenn Francis, a Malaysian, and one of his employees have also been arrested. Mr. Francis and two of the Navy officials charged in the case have pleaded not guilty. So this is followed then by another story, New York Times, November 20th. Navy was warned of contractor at center of bribery inquiry. Leonard Glenn Francis, a wealthy Malaysian contractor at the heart of one of the United States Navy's largest bribery scandals in decades, seemed to have stepped right off the set of Casablanca. At 6'3" and 350 pounds, Mr. Francis hosted dinners at luxury hotels in Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong for senior officers who knew him as Fat Leonard, dispensing boxes of Cuban cigars and dropping the names of admirals he knew, senior Navy officers said. But as his reputation for lavish parties spread, so did warnings about his business practices, according to Navy officials and court documents. Emails obtained by criminal investigators show that from 2009 to early 2011, several ship crews and contracting officials filed complaints about his gold-plated fees for fuel, port security, and other services. In 2010, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service opened investigations into questionable charges in Thailand and Japan by his company. Despite those red flags, in 2011, the Navy awarded Mr. Francis $200 million in contracts, giving him control over providing supplies and dockside services for its fleet across the Pacific. Now, Mr. Francis is at the center of a widening investigation into an overbilling scheme in which federal prosecutors say he used cash, prostitutes, and gifts to bribe Navy officials to help him defraud the service out of tens of millions of dollars. 2 Navy commanders and a naval investigative agent have been charged with accepting bribes, while 2 admirals and a captain are also under investigation. Investigation officials say they expect more service members to be implicated. Next point, military suicides drop amid array of new programs. Several times I've commented on the extent of military suicides. No one seemed to know why they were occurring so frequently. They, over the past year, were occurring at about the rate of 1 a day. But the services have a number of programs now that they are using in their usual ham-handed way, but they don't know why then the number has dropped somewhat recently either. The Army, which has by far the largest military service, has the highest number of suicides so far this year, 124, while the Air Force has 43, the Navy 38, and the Marines, the smallest service, had 40. I have my own theory about why this is happening, the deterioration of the military generally. It's the corruption that I've commented on, the suicides, and the sexual assaults occurring recently at the rate of about 71 a day. The picture there is somewhat as follows. Military sexual assault reports up 46%, the Pentagon says. Reports of sexual assaults in the military increased by an unprecedented 46% during the last fiscal year, the Pentagon said Thursday. It wasn't possible to know whether the spike represented an increase in assaults, an increase in the percentage of people reporting them, or both. So this has upset a number of senators, especially women senators, because these cases are usually not being investigated and punished correctly. They're trying to take the investigation and trials for these out of the chain of command, because in too many cases, the offender, the military member charged with rape, has been a buddy of the commander, or has been in authority over the victim, and it's become an intolerable situation. The Department of Defense estimates that a shocking 26,000 instances of rape, sexual assault, and unwanted sexual contact occurred in our military last year alone. That's an average of 71 cases every day. This is a statement by a number of U.S. senators, Begich, Blumenthal, Boxer, Gillibrand, and some others. So they are advocating a law which will remove these cases from the chain of command and prevent the kinds of injustices that have gone on, where such cases were often not prosecuted at all, or the person was giving a slap on the wrist or whatever. Case in point, military prostitution ring run by sexual assault prevention officers. Several young female privates from Fort Hood military bases in Killeen, Texas, testified in court last week that they were pressured to prostitute themselves to superiors. That's bad enough, but even worse is the shocking discovery that the senior soldier who pressed them was the officer whose job it was to prevent sexual assaults in his unit. These revelations came out in the military trial of Master Sergeant Brad Grimes, who on December 3rd was found guilty by a Fort Hood jury of conspiring to patronize a prostitute and solicit adultery. And so on in that vein. You can find this under the date of December 10th. Military members, when they get back, are they adequately supported by the Veterans Administration and the Pentagon? This story says service members left vulnerable to payday loans. It's illegal for loans to military members to exceed a certain percentage rate, but as it usually turns out, there's always a loophole, a ways of getting around the rule. Petty Officer First Class Vernaine Kelly winces when roughly $350 is automatically deducted from her Navy paycheck twice a month. Month after month, the money goes to cover payments on loans with annual interest rates of nearly 40%. The monthly scramble of scrimping, saving, and going without is a familiar one to her. More than a decade ago, she received her first payday loan to pay for moving expenses while her husband, a staff sergeant in the Marines, was deployed in Iraq. And then those loans tend to get pyramided by the payday loan companies, and it's a bad situation for a lot of people in the military, and it's strongly suspected that it's one of the reasons the financial situation is one of the main reasons for the large number of suicides. So latest entry then is, I'll stop after this, Senator Coburn's report on wasted money in the government. The government wasted $30 billion in 2013, he says. He has published a list of the 100 leading examples of government waste amounting to $30 billion this year. But this it seems to me dishonestly starts out with the expense of the setting up the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, and calling that a waste, and the attempts to publicize it so that people would know about it. Then it goes on to the military examples. Another big expense was a football-sized blimp called an unblinking eye that was supposed to provide nonstop surveillance over an Afghan battlefield. But the Army pulled the plug on the project this year after one test flight over New Jersey. The total waste, $297 million. The Army National Guard was also lambasted for throwing away $10 million on a Superman movie tie-in, while plans were being made to cut the strength of the Guard by 8,000 soldiers. The Department of Defense grounded the Air Force Thunderbirds and the Navy Blue Angels in the last year, but it also frittered away $634 million to construct aircraft they never intended to fly. The Defense Department also destroyed $7 billion worth of usable military equipment rather than selling it or having it shipped home. And indeed, there's another story here about all the military equipment in Afghanistan that's being scrapped and made unusable by anyone. It's being sold for scrap metal rather than give it to the Afghans or sending it back home to the USA. Well, this goes on and on and on, and I'll just stop there. It's rather appalling, I would say, but hey, outrage after outrage, we've got used to that, right?
Thanks, Ron. Ron Szoke on some Christmas cheer for the military, so to speak. And unfortunately, as you suggest, it's all too prevalent. Comments on that, Karen, on military malfeasance?
Yeah, we've had a lot of military malfeasance. My comment on the buildup of the military in Japan, of course, I'm totally opposed to that. I spent a summer studying in Japan, and I remember my professors, and that goes back quite a few years, back into the 70s, and they made a very strong point that we should never remilitarize Japan because it would just be a disaster. And one of the reasons the Japanese have been quite successful in business, or at least they had been for a while, is because they didn't have to put money into the military. Mm-hmm. They put their money into business. Mm-hmm. That's a means of success. Mm-hmm. But while I see this as somewhat disastrous, at the same time, my daughter watches ICTV. That's the Chinese channel. She watches it in California. I think there's some English, but it's primarily in Mandarin, and that's why she watches it. And according to her, when I expressed this concern to her, that, but there's all kinds of deals going on with the Chinese and the Japanese, which I do know, and that the Japanese recently released documents related to the names of prisoners during World War II to China, which is sort of the beginning of a reconciliation between them, because as we know, Japan has never admitted to the atrocities that were committed in China. She also knows that there's a huge community of Japanese doing business living in Shanghai and all over China, as do I. And we are also very aware that Asians often, they will reconcile through business interests behind closed doors. So there is hope. That's a hopeful note. On the Philippines, I find it equally disturbing. We've had our military presence there for a very long time, since we colonized them, which is a term people don't like to use, but it's accurate. What's so disturbing to me is that yes, we're giving them all this aid so that they will buy our military weapons. And of course, the upper echelons, the very wealthy, are very pleased with that because, of course, they profit from that. If nothing else, they're propped up by it. The poor, those people who were so destroyed, literally, by the recent typhoon, in the meantime, they don't even have land to go back to. Okay, same thing that happened in New Orleans, the same thing that happened in Thailand after the tsunami in Thailand and in Sri Lanka, is that the developers come in and they take over the land and they start developing. Usually because it's on the ocean, they start developing high-rise hotels, very expensive apartments, and then the poor have nowhere to go. And in the Philippines, the poor, most of them, they're landless. My only message is to them to just keep building. They live in corrugated, corrugated iron buildings anyway. And you know, the Philippines, of all the Southeast, of all the Asian nations, they never became a tiger. They were never successful. And some claims are that it's directly because of our presence and of our colonization. And having lived there, I did live in the Philippines. I lived in Manila. I lived in the very well-to-do areas, but you couldn't get away from the poverty. It was there in your face all the time. There was never, the infrastructure was very poor. I was there about 10 years ago, and the infrastructure was very poor at that time, as where at least throughout the other nations, you do see improvements in the infrastructure. You do not see anything in the Philippines. So when I hear about all of this aid being given for military buildup to the Philippines, it's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking when you see the suffering of the people. So I'll stop on that.
I think there are two dimensions here we should be particularly aware of today. One is what the United States is doing in the region. What the Obama administration is doing with its pivot to Asia, what that really means. It's a basketball metaphor of all things, but what it really means is, as Ron suggested, the American policy of containing China. And the containing is actually, I mean, look at a map, it's actually geographical in a part, that the America draws a big circle around China that includes the Middle East and also includes Japan. And that a lot of America policy, particularly in the Western Pacific, have to do with a military cordon that brings this question of the Chinese no-fly zone, or the Chinese notification zone. It's not a no-fly zone, into the news because of America's concern that we have military control over this region. That's what the administration is doing right now. The second dimension, it seems to me, and another one that we sadly don't know much about, is a century of U.S. involvement in Western Pacific, which might be argued as one of the most important world political narratives going back well before the Second World War. I mean, most people know that Japan and the United States contested for control of the Pacific in the Second World War, that the Second World War was really two wars, one in Asia and one in Europe. The Asian War, that was primarily between the United States and Japan, over control of the Pacific. But it didn't begin on December 7th, 1941, when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred. Japan and the United States had been at war, at least in terms of trade and sometimes in terms of actual military maneuvers, not with one another, but with reference to one another, so to speak, back to the end of the 19th century, when the American policy of an open door to China, which meant China would be open to exploitation by the U.S. and the other Western powers, the open door to China ran into Japanese expansion into the region. And the story is the story of from the Spanish-American War to the Second World War, to Pearl Harbor, the story of the rivalry between U.S. and Japan in that period is not much told, but it's the real background to the present administration's pivot to Asia. And unless we understand what's happened there, we don't understand a lot of the current events. Karen's description of the situation in the Philippines goes back to an event that Americans have forgotten entirely. We fought a Vietnam-style war in the Philippines at the end of the 19th century, at the turn of the century, and I mean, vicious war, and a racist war. It was consciously that on the part of the American troops. They were closer to the Civil War than they are to us, so to speak, and they saw themselves as essentially continuing the process of putting down lesser breeds without the law. That's a long history in the United States military behavior, more military malfeasance perhaps, Ron. But in Vietnam, the areas that were controlled by the Southern resistance were known to the military as Indian country. There's a continuity in America's wars here for more than a century that is bound up with what's going on now in the Western Pacific. And it's to our detriment, in a sense, that we don't know anything about it. And unless we understand what the United States is doing and has been doing for a long time, it's hard to make sense of what is actually happening there. American policy is not just dreamed up overnight. It's not just something that's come up this morning or this week or this month. American policy has a long backstory, and it's not particularly attractive because it's American imperialism, which has been the background of the developments in the Western Pacific for since your grandparents' time and before. So it's a story we should know. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We will press on now. Ron, do you have a follow-up? Or
No, I just wanted to mention there's always been a resistance also. The Anti-Imperialist League, which attracted
Yes.
such luminaries in 1898 as Mark Twain and the philosopher William James and so on. So we should mention and honor those people as well.
Absolutely
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, it's important.
My maternal grandfather, who was graduated from Annapolis in 1907 and rode horseback along the Great Wall of China before the Chinese Revolution as part of this American outreach to, outreach is a desiccated word, this American imperialism in China. His daughter wrote her doctoral dissertation on the Anti-Imperialist League, and because her father had lived in the world that league had created. It's a story, once again, that if we were actually doing American politics with a serious eye on where it comes from, a story that would be better known. Karen, do you want to talk about Mr. Charles Freeman, right?
Yeah, yes. Bear with me, my voice is going. Stuart Levy couldn't be with us tonight, but he suggested that we read this, so I will read it. This is from, let's see, Snowden Affair, Intelligence and Privacy in a Wired World, held on December 12th, 2013. And I note this is the concluding paragraph from Ambassador Charles Freeman's prepared remarks. Freedom requires checks and balances, not paternalistic monitoring by the government. It is now incontrovertible that we have failed to apply effective checks and balances to core national security and intelligence functions. No one in Washington or anywhere else should be in a position to turn a key and deprive us or our posterity of the blessings of liberty. Sorry, lost it for a moment. Okay. It is past time to rethink and radically downsize both the warfare state and the undisciplined surveillance apparatus it has given birth to. Freeman described Edward Snowden's act of civil disobedience as perhaps the most consequential such act for both our domestic liberties and our foreign relations in the more than 2-century-long history of our republic. We are not yet in a police state, Ambassador Freeman said, but we're building its infrastructure. The United States government is a vastly more potent threat to the traditions and civil liberties of our republic and to the rule of law than Al-Qaeda could ever hope to be, former ambassador told an audience at MIT Thursday night. Freeman, who spoke as if he were channeling MIT's Noam Chomsky, is no academic radical. Instead, he is a 30-year veteran of the State and Defense Departments, serving in various roles, including Richard Nixon's chief interpreter for his visit to China, George Bush's ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the 1990-91 Persian Gulf War, and more recently, Barack Obama's nominee to head the National Intelligence Council. In prepared remarks, Freeman called Edward Snowden's leaking of classified information a spectacular act of civil disobedience, blowing the whistle on the NSA's ruthless drive for digital omniscience. Snowden, a former contractor for the National Security Agency, provided journalists at The Guardian and The Washington Post a large trove of classified documents revealing United States operations to acquire information about every phone call in the United States and vast amounts of email and social network data, as well as activities to tap the internal networks of Google and Yahoo. Freeman appeared at MIT as part of an MIT Center for International Studies panel. The Snowden Affair, Intelligence and Privacy in a Wired World. Joining him was former NSA Inspector General Joel Brenner, who offered a strong defense of NSA activities and denounced Snowden. This NSA scandal, Brenner told the audience, was unique in that it involved activities that were legal and known to Congress. He said that while it would come as no surprise to our adversaries that we were seeking to intercept their communications, confirmation that we had succeeded could destroy years of intelligence work. Brenner bristled at the characterization of Snowden's actions as civil disobedience, noting that famous American acts of civil disobedience included that participant's willingness to serve jail time. Freeman, who with Brenner holds a law degree from Harvard, said that Snowden feared the prospect of not having a fair trial, being subject to cruel and unusual punishment, and being silenced in order to preclude an informal public policy debate. But rather than being able to dismiss such fears as outlandish, post-9/11 justice, according to Freeman, includes practices not seen in our political culture since the abolition of the Star Chamber by the Habeas Corpus Act of 1640, have again become commonplace. Such practices include, but are not limited to, detention without charge or trial, various forms of physical and psychological abuse, and the extrajudicial murder of American citizens on the orders of the President. All of these are facilitated by electronic eavesdropping, as is state terrorism by drone and death squad. Like the inhabitants of countries we condemn for gross violations of human rights, Americans are now subject to warrantless surveillance of our electronic interactions with each other. The arbitrary seizure at the border of our computers and private correspondence, the use of torture and degrading practices in interrogation and pre-trial detention and prosecution upon evidence we cannot see or challenge because it is classified.
Yeah. In scare quotes, classified.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
yes, yes. Signals intelligence is the rubric under which the NSA collects all manner of communications, derives from battlefield commanders' need for situational awareness, and should not be restrained, said Freeman. It is the transition of this function from the battlefield to threats only tangentially related to our national security that fails to build intelligence activities in a manner supportive of our liberties and our alliances with foreign nations. We are not yet in a police state, Freeman said, but we are building its infrastructure, and because of the hollowness of judicial and legislative oversight, are depending on the self-restraint of those in authority. Self-restraint is not sustainable, Freeman observed, saying history protests that if one builds a turnkey totalitarian state, those who hold the keys will eventually turn them.
Thank you, Karen. Comment on that, Ron?
Yeah, it's remarkable the way these themes and arrangements keep reappearing. The Star Chamber, letters de cachet, people being killed or exiled by a secret message from the sovereign, and so on. It's all coming back. So I would say, echoing Freeman, we're not all the way there yet, but sometime I want to talk about Big Uncle is watching you. That is Uncle Sam, and he is slowly changing into Big Brother. And is that too facile? Well, perhaps, but it's a theme I'll come back to. There was another statement in there when Freeman was nominated to be head of some security or intelligence agency.
Yes.
He ascribes his rejection as due to the resistance of the Israel lobby.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. He wasn't appropriately enthusiastic about Israel, and that was he was drummed out. He was denied his appointment as head of the National Intelligence Council for that reason.
Then we should mention, a few days later, federal judge Richard Leon of the United States Federal District Court of District of Columbia ruled that mass surveillance of this kind was very probably unconstitutional. So these little cracks have started to appear in the establishment about this stuff, and which gives us some hope, because that's what really turned the country around on the Vietnam War, is when the elite started to have doubts about it.
That's, well, I hope you're right, Ron. I really do.
Well,
it
it
seems
had to be
me,
followed by a popular uprising, of course, too. But.
Yeah, well,
it
yeah.
certainly did. And the business, this court decision is important. I agree with you. It looks an awful lot like the decision of the New York judge who struck down the NDAA requirement for allowance of indefinite detention without trial that Congress blithely wrote into the law 2 years ago at the behest of the Obama administration. The judge knocked that down. It's obviously unconstitutional, and I can't think of too many things that would be more obviously unconstitutional. But all that happened was that the judge's decision was set aside when the government appealed. And the government is vigorously appealing this decision about the NSA at the moment, so I don't really expect too much from it. But you're also right that it seems to me that as a straw in the wind, as an indication of what's happening, as an indication of what Americans are insisting upon, it is indeed important. In the history of the American courts, it seems to me that if you can generalize sweepingly about it, the courts are willing to uphold the law in a way that disobliges the executive or the 1% only when there's a large enough popular support for it.
Right.
Everything from Brown versus Board of Education to, as you say, the Vietnam cases and whatnot, to all the free speech cases of the 20th century. They occurred not because the judges looked at the law and saw the obvious contradictions between what the government was doing and what the law said, but because enough Americans were screaming about it that the judges decided, yes, something must be done here.
Well, it's one of those difficult problems of causation. But anyway, it's interesting that this judge.
No, but I think whichever you want to say is the more important cause, they have to go together.
Right.
That's the point.
Yeah. This judge was nominated by George W. Bush also.
Absolutely.
Well, that does bring up the case that I think there are unfortunately going to be a lot of people out there who are going to say, oh, well, it's all political. So these are all Republicans now that are speaking out against Obama's policies. But the reality is, yeah, and they know that they were begun, some of this NSA surveillance really took hold under the Bush administration. But the fact that Obama has continued them and allowed them, Ron Wyden, the senator of Oregon, has been fighting this. And I just read something today whereby he's so happy. He, like Mr. Freeman, feels very strongly that he's been vindicated by Snowden's revelations. But unfortunately, when his assistant was asked, given the fact that Obama has set up a 5-man committee to study the issues, was there hope? The assistant said, well, hope springs eternal. But that wasn't, hope springs eternal.
Sure.
But they're not expecting anything. So one can claim that, oh, this is all political, that these are Republicans. No, it is what it is.
It's a good example because that 5-member panel is chosen entirely from the DIA establishment. I mean, these are all people. Yeah,
yeah, that's right.
Right. I remember there's a great cartoon I used to have on my office door from the publication The Masses in the 20s, and it showed this sort of loathsome beast sitting naked in a a great bed, surrounded by pieces by bones and various sort of other things, and very carefully peering under its left arm, looking like this, and the caption was, "The system examines itself."
Oh, very good. Okay. Yeah.
It seems to me that's what we're. Yeah,
that's what we're seeing. Certainly conjured up an image that I'm trying to reject.
I'll put that up on the AWARE Facebook page because it's a classic cartoon, and so all too applicable to our present situation. There's another point that you made in the summary of Charles Freeman's MIT talk, Karen, that I want to come back to. That was presented at MIT as as a discussion between Charles Freeman and an administration spook. Brenner was his name?
Brenner, yes, yes.
Both of them are apparently Harvard Law, contemporaries at Harvard Law.
Right.
And which is cute, you know, and also indicative of what we're dealing with here. But this guy made Freeman's opponent made an argument that you hear frequently, and in relationship to the Snowden case and the whistleblower cases and so forth, that I think has got to be one of the most stupid and cynical political lines that's been used in some time, and that's saying something. And the argument is this: what Snowden, Manning, and in a sense Assange did can't be called civil disobedience, because in the great history of civil disobedience, I hope you hear the quotation marks around what I'm saying, in the great history of civil disobedience, such as Martin Luther King, there is always the requirement, the understanding, that those engaged in civil disobedience are ready to go to jail in order to complete their act of civil disobedience. And therefore, since Snowden wasn't ready to go to jail, since Snowden, yeah, exactly, it can't be considered civil disobedience. Now, that's wrong in so many ways. It's a category mistake for one thing, and has nothing to do with, you know. It's a frequent comment. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard that argument since Snowden's appearance. And this is...
it's absurd.
It's absurd.
And it's coming from legally, you know, they were educated in the law at Harvard. I hate to keep bashing Harvard, since
that's
you
not
were
not
a graduate.
Not a problem.
Since you were a graduate of Harvard. But did you know Charles Friedman by any chance?
No, I never met him.
Oh, okay.
No, I never met him, although we are roughly contemporaries.
Right.
As I don't know. I don't know him only from
because
the
you
news
mentioned
accounts.
something that earlier that okay. Yeah, it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And given the treatment that given the treatment that people who are incarcerated for being whistleblowers today, look at the way they treated Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manley.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's just...
You're watching Aware on the Air. Do we have other business before the assembly this afternoon? Ron, you have other points you want to bring up?
Yes. The problem about reaching an agreement with Iran and the increasing threat that Congress will prevent this from happening, reaching any kind of agreement about freezing the nuclear refinement and holding off further developments for 6 months is being undercut, subverted by certain members of Congress who are urging the American government to impose more conditions, more sanctions against Iran while this is going on. And Iran is quickly pointing out, quite rightly, that this is against the spirit of the whole agreement, and it looks very much as if they're trying to prevent any agreement from ultimately being reached about the degree of nuclear armament that Iran will be allowed by the USA and, of course, Israel. But Iran pulls out of talks over U.S. sanctions. Nation says that further blacklisting is against the spirit of the agreement. This was in the local paper on the December 14th. And then today, there's a piece in the New York Times, which is kind of strange.
What's something
Saudi ambassador to England says we're going to go it alone because the USA has not been sufficiently aggressive against Iran and against Syria. And what does that mean?
Yeah, what does it mean?
No idea, but it seems to be extremely weird. So I hope you have some insights about that.
The point is one that is typical, unfortunately, of where the U.S. is in the Middle East right now, in that our principal allies are the unlikely combination of Israel and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. is right fist and left fist, if we were talking in Chinese terms perhaps here, you know, of this, are the Israelis and the Saudis, or to change the metaphor, the major military bases of the U.S., the stationary aircraft carrier of Israel on the one hand, and the reserve army on the other hand of the Saudis and their money. For all the talk about Arabs and Israelis and whatnot and inveterate hatred and so forth, what we actually have is an alliance between the Saudis and the Israelis, working as deputies of the United States in order to control the region. That's what it's all about. And there is suggestion from both Israel and Saudi Arabia right now that the U.S. is not being vigorous enough, i.e. it's not killing enough people, to ensure its control. And that's what we were getting from the Saudi ambassador you mentioned, Ron. And of course we've been getting plenty of that from the Prime Minister of Israel again and again. So much so that even the Israelis are saying that he's particularly nutty on this issue. But that's nevertheless the position of the Israeli government. I think it's worthwhile to reflect on what the U.S. is really doing with Iran here. Even the discussion in the liberal press has to do with, well, can the U.S. actually live with an Iranian nuclear weapon? Can the U.S. do something more or something less or something different or something of another sort in order to stop an Iranian nuclear weapon is not the issue.
Right.
That's not what's at stake here.
It's not
I mean,
in existence.
you take one look at it, and it's obvious. The Israelis, although the Americans and the Israelis can't admit it, the Israelis have hundreds, literally hundreds of high-tech nuclear weapons. The U.S. has high-tech nuclear weapons throughout the region, on shipboard and on bases throughout the region. I mean, the area is sodden with nuclear weapons, and you're telling me that if the Iranians managed to build one, the military structure of the Middle East is knocked out of whack? Well, actually, there's a sense in which that's true. And the sense is that an Iranian nuclear weapon would be a defensive weapon. It would be a weapon that would stop Israel and the United States from attacking Iran with nuclear weapons because of the fear of the use of that nuclear weapon in defense.
Right.
Even the most raging Israeli hawk would not admit that attacking Iran would be a good idea if the price were Tel Aviv. And so the defensive weapon, the defensive nature of the weapon is illustrated by the fact that when the U.S. attacked Iraq on the grounds of their weapons of mass destruction, which were non-existent, the attack went well because there were no weapons of mass destruction. At the same time, the U.S. was making similar threats, contrary to the UN Charter, against North Korea. But the U.S. didn't attack North Korea. Why not? North Korea really does have defensive nuclear weapons.
Right. Carl, maybe that's the answer to the question that was asked earlier. What is Saudi Arabia doing, Ron, you were asking? Maybe that's the concern, because at this point, Iran doesn't have a nuclear capacity.
Right.
So if you're going to strike them and take over, which is what the U.S. and Saudi want to do, you better do it now before they do have a nuclear weapon as a deterrent.
Well,
and they'd be crazy not to want a deterrent.
Yes.
Because they're so vulnerable.
Yeah. I think Iran having a nuclear weapon would contribute to the stability of the Middle East, actually, and would help quiet all of these threats that are coming from Israel, which is trying to push the USA into a war with Iran and really promoting that kind of conflict. And I think it's utterly foolish from the standpoint of both Israel and the USA, but a lot of people are not saying that. So.
And we have to put this back into the context of the oil politics and the overriding concern of the United States in the region, which is the control of the flows of oil. That's the real problem with Iran, that and the fact that the Iranians had the ill grace to throw out the dictator we imposed on them years ago. And I mean, you know, the U.S. has never forgiven them for that. I mean, we had a perfectly good dictator that was oppressing your country, and you threw him out, and, you know, we're going to try to restore the status quo ante. But in any case, what the U.S. is really concerned about, the fact is that Iran is a major oil producer. And that also is what Saudi Arabia is concerned about. The economic conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the Gulf region in general is part of the reason for the Saudi hostility. And it's most of the reason for the Americans to look to find a way to bring Iran back into that control, that American control that existed between 1953 and 1979. Now, the problem here is that it's the American desire to control the oil flows that conflicts slightly with its creatures, Saudi Arabia's desire to be rid of the competition of Iran. And there's a real fear, pointed out by the Saudi ambassador that Ron just quoted, that the U.S. will do a deal with Iran, that there will be a diplomatic revolution, and that the U.S. major clients in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia, will be forced to an uneasy alliance with a now America-friendly Iran. Now that's,
that makes sense. Okay.
That's not, it seems to me that's not likely, but the U.S., I mean, it was Henry Kissinger, of course, who quoted the famous British maxim that we have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And the U.S. permanent interests are here at stake. Yeah. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 51st week of 2013. It's what the White House calls Terror Tuesday, by the way, the day each week when President Obama picks out some people to be murdered by drones or U.S. death squads, the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command. You've heard, of course, that a drone strike in Yemen this week hit another wedding party, killing 17 people. The administration is saying, well, some of them were terrorists. It was a wedding party, they can't deny that, but some of them were terrorists. The interesting thing is that we know from how the administration behaves that these people were chosen to be killed by President Obama, on his way to the Mandela celebration in South Africa. The great prophet of reconciliation was celebrated by Obama. He apparently celebrated some other things too, but the real point was that he had picked out people to be killed by this drone strike in Yemen before he left or maybe on the way. And we don't pay too much attention to what's happening there. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. We also want to remind you of other programs like ours here on UPTV, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. Weekdays, Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. Democracy Now!, at 8 a.m. The Big Picture, and Democracy Now! Repeated again in the evening. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.